All right, we're going to retry this. My mic is on this time. Welcome to week 12 mobile web applications. We're going to get right into it and start off from where we left off last week. We'll do a little recap to kind of get our head in that headspace. And we're going to continue building this to-do app in ReactJS. So I've got the PowerPoint here. I'll just bring it over and share my screen. So we left off on slide 37, and we were talking about how you can have dynamic statements inside of those curly braces with JavaScript, okay? Now, just to kind of recap everything we did, last week we used this command, npx create react app, in our terminal, and you had to actually cd or change directory into the file path you want to create the React app. And we actually used this template command to create a PWA template. Right, so then it started off with this, and then we actually deleted a bunch of files and a bunch of lines of code that referenced the files that we deleted. So we kind of started with a really, bare bones, fresh template. And then we looked at building our own component and what components were. And we kind of talked about how components are reusable bits of HTML or JavaScript code that we can call like this in HTML-like syntax, but it's actually in a language called JSX, right? And that's the power of React, where ReactJS comes in, is it allows us to reuse these bits of code way easier than having to do it in native JavaScript. All right, so then we kind of looked at how a React app works and how it puts this app function, right, and it returns that function into the div ID root, right? And we looked at how it works and how you can navigate. How come we don't see this JSX code in our browser when we inspect the element? We covered all of that stuff. We also talked about adding classes to ReactJS, and because it's actually technically JSX code, we have to use the native JavaScript keyword class name, not the default HTML class word, right? So we have to do class name when you're adding a class for styling. So we styled our page, okay? And we added some background color, borders, and all of that good stuff so we could start to make these little to-do list cards. All right, we made the background gray, we changed some font sizes and font families, and then we wanted to make these buttons actually functional, right? And we talked about if we wanted to add functionality to the buttons, well, you could just add a button or in this example, we put a span in each little chunk of code, but then you have to repeat that all over the entire website wherever you have a to-do list item, and it wouldn't be able to dynamically change when the user adds a to-do list. So what we decided to do, or what ReactJS allows us to do, is to actually take that code and create a component from it, and we could actually create our own custom to-do component, and then we copied the code from our app. Okay, this was our original app component, had everything all in one place. And then we decided to break it up into two little chunks here. So we took the code from there, and then we made a to-do component, and it returns itself as a function. It returns this JSX code in here and exports that as the to-do component. Then we can use the to-do component here on line 8. You can see in the green text, it looks like an HTML element. It acts like an HTML element, but it actually just renders the code that's returned from to-do.js. And then we got the same functionality, but now the main difference is we can replicate that to-do as many times as we wanted, right? So then here we have 3 of them. Okay, then we started playing around with props, right? So good memory on that one. We covered props just at the end of last week, where you could add a property and you can call it whatever you want. Here we called it text, and then we pass in the value, so it's a key value pair. And then if you follow these red arrows, they go into the props, and we can access the props properties with using that dot operator there. So props.text will then render whatever text value we passed into it for each to-do list, right? So we had 3 of them. So what will actually happen is, here we go, we can see we have 3 different text attributes in our props. All right. Then I think the last slide I actually was covering was showing you why that works. And the reason it works is because we're calling props.text, which is JavaScript, but we're calling props.text in JSX, which is like HTML. So how can you actually write JavaScript when we're in like an HTML block like that H2 there, right? Well, the reason we can do it is because we have these curly braces. So here I have 2 curly braces with 2 plus 2 in it. And anytime you write something inside of those curly braces in JSX code, it'll render the JavaScript. So it'll actually treat it as an expression. So 2 plus 2, it'll actually render that expression as 4. So here's that example with 2 plus 2 being 4, right? So that's why props.texts actually works, because we're accessing that props property. Okay, so that's our little recap, and now we're ready to start off from where we were. So let's continue. Let's get into our project here, and I'll show you a little cool way to actually get it running without having to CD into your entire folder. So here we are in Visual Studio Code. I've got my project open. I haven't touched anything. I haven't changed anything. It's the exact same as where we left off last week. Now there's this little window called Terminal, right? I'll turn my mouse highlighter on so you can follow along. And what I'll do is I'll create a new terminal. And what this does is it actually creates a command prompt window down in the bottom of my view pane, and it's automatically in the file directory path that I'm currently in for my project, right? So my project's here. Here's my file explorer. And we can see it's, on my desktop in this folder called Teaching Georgian Mobile Web Applications Week 11. So here we are in Desktop Teaching Georgian Mobile Web Applications Week 11. And remember, who remembers what's the command we have to run to start our application, to start our server? Does anyone remember? Quiz for you. Oh, there's a shortcut. Okay, that's cool. That actually starts the that actually starts the server for you, or that starts the terminal? Oh, cool. Right on. There we go. Okay, thank you. So that's what I was looking for there, Drew. So npm start is the command that we can run. So we'll run that here, and it'll treat it just like it's any other terminal or like command prompt window. And we can see here it's triggered the React scripts start script, and that's going to start a server on my local host and actually host the files that I've got in this file directory path, right? So it'll use all of my node package managers. It'll run all of the React scripts, the JavaScript, the HTML, and it's just loading up here on my browser. I'll drag it over. This is a development server here. Perfect. So then while that's loading, should be pretty quick. There we go. All right, awesome. And I think did we also add, no, okay, so that's the other thing we haven't done yet. So we got our text to dynamically display, right? Very cool. And we can pass that text in. Now we want to be able to actually have these buttons have some functionality, right? So in order to do that, how I'm picturing this and how we're going to do it is when I click delete, we'll have a little overlay window that will show up like, right here, I guess. See, it'll be like a box right here, and there'll be like 2 buttons in the bottom. It'll be like a delete or a cancel.
I'm
Right.
not, excuse me, Ben. I'm not
There'll be
sure
a bunch
where
of text here.
your screen is just showing your code in VS Code. I'm not sure if you're trying to show something else as well, but just thought I'd give you a heads up on that.
Okay. Is it showing I'm in my browser window.
No,
Is it,
not showing.
no, it's not showing it? Okay, how about now?
No.
Oh, I see. I need to change my sharing settings here. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So stop sharing. I was trying to share the website. Okay. 1 second. We'll go back into WebEx. For some reason, it was defaulting to only sharing one application. Okay, you can only see the Visual Studio screen. Okay, screen 1. I want to share the entire desktop. Go. Yes. Share. Okay. Should be able to see it now. Let me know if you can see the browser window as well as the Visual Studio Code window. I have them both open. Okay, cool. I got some thumbs ups. Awesome. All right. Let me get my chat window open here again because that closed. And we should be good to continue. All right. Just expand that a little bit. Okay, so what I was saying right here was these delete buttons, right? They don't do anything. We want them to do something. So what I'm thinking we'll have is we'll have like a little pop-up that'll show up here in the middle of the screen when you click this button. And on the pop-up, there'll be two buttons, right? There'll be a cancel. So if we change our mind, and then there'll be a delete, right? And then there'll be a bunch of text here that'll say like, do you want to delete? And then it will be, whatever text we have from here should show up there, right? As a prop. I guess that should be an arrow, right? Anyways, so that's what I'm hoping to build here. So let's try to add some functionality so that these buttons actually have click events, and that when that click event happens, it actually triggers some logic. Okay, so this is all laid out in the PowerPoint for us. Oops, I'll just start projecting that here. Wow. Trying to bring that over. This mouse highlighter really slows my mouse down. Okay, so I might just turn it off if you guys can follow along. All right, so we were here. Now, we want to add an event listener, right? Or a click listener. So the old way to do it in JavaScript, just native vanilla JavaScript, was you do document.querySelector button. That's what our thing would be called, have the ID of button, and then it'd be .add event listener click, right? And then you'd have a function that would happen after that. That's the old way of doing it, okay? Now the new way of doing it is we can, just like we added a property to our text or to our to-dos that we passed in props, we can also pass in an on-click function and call it delete handler, and then we handle that function up here, okay, in our component. So each div or h2 element in JSX code, okay, right here, h2 div, all of these defaults, they're actually React components under the hood. Okay, so React actually just pre-made an entire library that have the same names as HTML elements, right? So that we kind of think of them as the same thing. And they all act and look like regular HTML elements, but technically they're all React components. Okay, this is important because what this means is we can add an on-click attribute on any element, right? Okay, and that's important to recognize. So button is a pre-made component in React, right? So then we can add an on-click attribute. We don't have to execute of the function with delete handler because it'll evaluate the code right away before the button's clicked here. So we just want to point to the function by using its name, right? So if we actually put the code in here, like on click, console.log, whatever, then what would happen is it would just execute right away. So what we want to do is we want to tell React that this function is the function that will be executed when the element's clicked. So function delete handler here won't actually run until this onClick event's triggered. So what we need to do is, in order to create the function to handle the click, we actually need to create what's called a nested function. You'll see this in the comment. It's a nested function inside of the to-do function. Because React components are basically functions, so we can see here we have function to do. Well, we have to create a function inside of that function to handle that on click. So here we have another function delete handler. All right, so we write a nested function. This is convention. This is normal. This is how you do it in React, okay? We write normal JavaScript code in the nested functions, all right, above this return. Inside of the return, it's always JSX, right? It's like that weird HTML JavaScript combo. But up above it, it's just plain vanilla, plain JavaScript, all right? You can still use props.text up here, but you don't have to put it into curly braces anymore because we're just writing in JavaScript, right? We're not inside that return statement, okay? And we just want to show an overlay showing up, but first we'll just do a little console.log just to make sure that when we click it, it's actually working. Okay, so going to our code, we'll go to our to-do.js, and we actually maybe did this last week a little bit. So we had our onClick function with delete handler, and delete handler corresponded up here to this. And when we clicked it, we passed it props.txt. So I think we did cover this last week a little bit. So if I open up my console in this browser, let me change. This is docked here. Don't want it to be mobile. Okay. So if I go to the console and I clear it, yeah, totally. So when I click this, we can see it's clicking them. Now if I clear it, if I click go grocery shopping, we can see it says clicked, go grocery shopping. Eat ice cream, there it is, eat ice cream. Finish React assignment, finish React assignment. So each one has its own click event. Okay, so we did that last week. All right, so that's not new. So moving on, we want to actually trigger some logic now. Instead of just printing to the console, we want to create what's called a modal. And a modal is another word for that overlay. All right, so you might see modal out there when you're working in the workplace. You might see overlay or that little pop-up that we're trying to talk about. So in order to do this, we could add that code to the same to-do.js, but it's actually best practice to separate them into separate components. And it takes a lot of experience and a lot of time as a React or a web developer to know when to split up your components. So that comes with experience. Don't worry about that. But basically, an easy rule to follow when to split up a component, you want it to be small. Each component you want to be small and maintainable. So in this example, we're going to make a new component for the overlay, right? So you want each almost physical element to have its own component in the code behind the scenes, if that makes sense. So you want to keep them small, maintainable. We can pass props to this modal function as well if we want to. So all components can receive the props parameter automatically. And if we don't need it, then we can just omit it. So if we wanted to pass props up here, just like we did with to-do.js, we could totally do that. Okay, in addition to this overlay, we kind of want a backdrop, we want to gray out the rest of the screen so that it blocks interaction with other buttons while they're interacting with this pop-up or this modal. So we'll need another component for the backdrop, if that makes sense. Okay, so let's create this modal, and we'll go to our Visual Studio Code, and on the components folder, I'll just create new file. And my new file will be, remember we have to use...
A minute, Ben.
Yeah.
My delete handler, I wasn't up to there last week, and when I do it, it's got it underlined as an unused variable. Do we have to put it somewhere else, the function delete handler?
So line 11, I have on click and then in curly braces, I call delete handler.
On
See right
line
here? I'll turn on my
of which, oh, okay, the to
right here.
do.
And what's important here is
Oh, okay,
you
that's
call
why.
delete handler, but you don't call delete handler with the parentheses because then that'll just call the function. You just want to point to the name of the function that will be called when on click fires.
Okay, all right,
Right? Yeah.
thanks.
Okay, so we are currently creating a new component called modal.js. And remember, we have to use capital letters when we create components because that's how React differentiates between custom components that the user creates and existing components that React has in its library. So we'll create modal.js and we have a brand new empty document here. I'll just close my terminal for now so I have more room. And did that work for you, Michelle? Is it running now?
Sorry, I'm still trying to get it typed in there.
Yeah, so just this right here. Put this line of code in the chat. So this is what I have in mind on my line 11. All right, so modal.js. Remember, components are just functions, and we just return the function. So it's just a function. It's nothing crazy. So function, and then we call it what we call it, function modal. And it just has to return some JSX code, right? So after that, we just export default. Remember, we learned about what export default does a couple weeks ago with our refresher to JavaScript. So if you missed that, then go back and watch that video. But export default basically exports this function as our main function to export from this file. So now we want to return some JSX code. So in here we can put our divs, our HTML, kind of JSX code, right? So for our overlay, I'm thinking we'll want a div, and inside of that div we'll have a paragraph that will say, are you sure? Right? And we'll end the p tag. Then after that p tag, we'll have two buttons, like I mentioned before, right? So we'll have a button that will say cancel, and then I'll just copy and paste that. Whoops. And we'll have a button that says confirm. So they can either cancel or confirm to delete, right? Okay. So that's all good. Now we want to style it a little bit. So we'll add some classes to these. To the first div, we'll add a class name, where it has to be class name, can't be just class, and we'll call this modal. And in our CSS, index.css, we will add a new class right here called .modal, where we will actually use that to do our CSS code on the selectors. So we'll have a couple of things here: box shadow 0, 1 pixel, 4 pixels, and an RGBA value of 0, 0, 0, and 0.2. So box shadow is just going to put a little shadow behind our little pop-up window. A border radius of 6 pixels. So that'll just round the corners. And then a background color of white. Okay. Padding of 1 rem. Text align. And this entire styling is available in the PowerPoint. If we skip past this too fast for you, I'll try to give you guys a couple minutes to type this all out. Width, we'll do 30 rem, so that'll just make the width a fixed size. The z index we're going to set to 10. So what a z-index is if you kind of think of like different axes, you have your y and your x like this, right? If you've ever looked at a graph. The z-index is your in and your out, right? So a z-index of 10 is like right, way up at the front, and a z-index of like 99 is way at the back. So we want this to show up on the front of our page. We want it to pop up in front of whatever the users may be looking at. So z-index of 10, position fixed. We'll give it some top here, H and left, calc 50%, REM. So that's just going to be a bit of a dynamic width there for margin from the left. Okay, so that is what we've got for our styling on our modal class. Okay, I'll give a couple minutes for you guys to just copy that down. And you guys can just shoot a little thumbs up when you are all good to go, and we'll continue to add a little bit of logic here for that. So I'll just pause the recording until I get a couple thumbs ups. Continue. Okay, cool. So welcome back. We have typed out our CSS for this, and it is all in the PowerPoint here. So if you want access to it, it's all screenshotted there as well. Okay, so moving on, I said we needed two things, right? We needed that modal, that little pop-up window, and then we need a gray background that will just block the user from clicking anything other than the modal itself, right? So we'll create another component for this called backdrop. And this is actually going to be reusable because if we ever need a backdrop for anything else in our application, then we'll have this backdrop component created already. So let's right click on our components folder here and do another new file, capital B backdrop, backdrop.js, right? So backdrop.js, I'll click enter, it'll bring us to a new file that'll be completely empty. And remember, components are just functions, nothing crazy. Function, you call it what we call it in the file, function backdrop, and it just has to return some JSX code inside of that return statement. And then we just export it as the default function, right? Okay, so that's all a component is. Now, all we want to return in here really is a div, and that div we'll give some styling to. We'll give it a class name of backdrop, right? And now we can style our backdrop to look however we want. We can make it 100% width, 100% height, and then change the background color to be gray or something like that, right? So let's do this. So we've got our modal, and then we're going to do our dot backdrop code now, right? So here's our backdrop.js. I'll pause on that for a second in case you guys are still writing that out. So remember, it's just returning a div inside of the return statement, inside a function, and then we're just exporting that function. That's all that's happening in here. All right, and then moving on to the CSS. So we've got our class that we've referenced in that div.backdrop, and we're going to add a couple of different selectors here that we want to affect. So we want it to be fixed. We're going to give it a Z index of 1, right? So now we've got 3 things with Z indexes. I'm trying to grab things on my desk here that would make sense to show you. Okay, so I've got a piece of paper that is my website, okay? And then I've got my modal at Z index 10, right? So if we look at from the side, it's like this. And now we've added Z index 1, which, I don't know, would maybe be, just gonna grab something. This gift card, right? It's gonna be a 1, so it's gonna be right in front of our backdrop, and then this is gonna be 10. So our modal will show up first with the pop-up window, then our background, right? There's a little gift card, and then the website. So I know it's a rough example. I don't have big sheets of paper to show you, but it's just the way we layer it. And the higher the number, the closer to the uh, user point of view. All right, so Z index of 1 so that it's in between the modal and the website. All right, now we can give it our background color, and we want it to be not this 0.75, not as dark. Okay, still dark, but then we're going to give it some I guess that's the opacity of it. Okay, so then we're going to give it some width and height. Width, 100%. Obviously, we want it to take up the entire screen. It's a backdrop. And then the height, we want it to be 100 as well. And then we want it to be aligned with the top at 0 and left at 0. So what that's saying is, if you look at your screen, if I were to draw this right here, right? If this is my website, I want it to be left 0. Whoops. I want it to be left 0, and I want it to be up at the top 0, right? So it's going to basically end up right there. Okay. So that's what that's doing. So left and top 0. Cool. So it's going to start at the very top. It's going to go 100% across, 100 down, and then fill it with a background color. So we'll save that. Nothing too complicated about this. Whoops. Save that. Perfect. And there's our code again in the PowerPoint. So now we need to implement these two things. So we've created two components. Now we need to actually reference them and get them in here. So we want it to look like this, right? This picture here. So we've got our to-do that's passing the properties, the text values. And then what we can do, now you don't have to follow along here. You can just watch me for this, okay? If you follow along, it might just be a bit more confusing for you. So you can just kind of sit back and relax as I show you this. Okay, so we've got our to-dos here, right? Now, what we can do is the same way we called our to-do component, we can call our modal component and our backdrop component, okay? The same way. And so they're right here, and I've called them the same way I've called my to-do. However, if I go here and close this, refresh it. So the problem now is my modal is always on, okay? And if I click off of it, or if I hit confirm or cancel, nothing happens. Our interface is just static. Right now, we need to make it dynamic. We need state, okay? So this is kind of what I brought up at the end of class last week. One of you asked if you wanted to show a different screen depending on what a user clicked. How could you do that? Well, it's with state, and state is a huge concept in React to understand. It's a big deal, and it's really, really useful. It's kind of how Netflix changes from like the My Movies screen to the My List screen. And to do this, to close our modal here and show the to-dos, we could have different states that the app can be in. So React has built this concept to help with this. So obviously, going to my website here, we can kind of test the styling to see if it's working. Obviously, my styling is not working, so let's try to fix that a little bit. I think I'm missing some classes here in my modal. Class name modal. Modal, backdrop, class name backdrop. Slides to make sure. The other classes I was missing in my modal.js. I want to, so in index.cs here, we created these button classes, btn. right? And they already exist on our to-do, right? We use that BTN class. Well, we can reuse the same code on our modal buttons. We'll just add a class name equals, and then we'll just give it a BTN, and then a BTN dash dash alt. Okay, so that's if the button doesn't load, it shows that. And then we'll give the second button, the confirm button, a BTN class as well. Okay, so if I save this, we should see that update occur, and it should be a red button. Perfect. Very good. Now I just need to figure out why it's not centering, but that's fine. If I refresh. Okay. So our styling's working. That's good. Okay. So we're talking about state a little bit. All right. In order to achieve different statuses of our application or different states that it can be in, we need to understand what state is and how to use it. So it's part of a library that React has created, and we can import it into our app. As you can see here, we have imported React so that we get access to all of the React JSX components that come pre-built for us. And then we also import use state, okay? And that's from the React library. And with use state, we can register different states that we want to have in our application. So we can give it, here we can see that there's a state called modal is open, and that can be either true or false. Okay, so a state can be true or false. So we can register those states with our application. Now, this can get confusing, so try to stick with me here, and I'll explain it as many times as I need to, because it will sink in once you see it happen on the screen. So if you need to sit back and then code it again, and we'll go through it a second time, then that's totally okay. So what we do is we register these states with our application. So we tell our application at the beginning, hey, these are the different states my app can have. Modal is open, can be true or false. And then React will react to those changes in that state. So it'll either render one output or another output depending on which state is active. So if it's true or false, it'll render different code depending on that Boolean value if it's true or false. So this all starts with calling the use state function here on line 6, okay, which is called directly inside of our components. So this is in todo.js. Okay, and this is what's called a React hook. And these can only be called directly in component functions. Okay, and we'll learn, well, we probably won't have time to cover hooks, but this is a basic concept of a React hook. And a hook is just something that kind of sits there, and when a change happens, it triggers things somewhere else, right? So you'll hear of Git hooks and web hooks and all that kind of stuff in programming. And a hook basically triggers something else, right? So you've got a hook in something else, and if something happens there, then it triggers back here. Almost like when you're fishing and you hook into a fish, well, it also triggers you as the fisherman to change something, right? So you've got a hook right there. Now, we can use this use state function and give it an initial starting value. Okay, so here with this red arrow, where that is, this is the initial value for the state that I created called modal is open. So we can see I gave it a name here. This is the name. This value stores the Boolean, either true or false. So that's the name of my state that I created. And I'm default going to set it to false. So modal being open and displaying, default, false. It's not going to be there. Okay. Now, that's us setting the default value. Now, when we put in a Boolean value of false, okay, use state will always return an array with 2 elements. Okay, so because we put in false, and this is a function, use state is a function, and we have it on the right side of the equals operator, it's going to return an array of two elements, and it's going to put them into these two variables that I've created as constants. Okay, so the first one that it's going to put into the array, all right, is going to be modal is open, and that's going to be the value that's going to be what holds that true or false value. So that's the const that holds the true or false value. The second one, the second value in the array is a function that we're going to be now able to access or call to set a new value for the state. So we'll be able to call set modal is open and then pass it a Boolean value, either true or false, and then update which state is currently active. Okay, so it'll re-render all of the components on the screen once this is called. So hopefully that makes sense. The first one is the value itself, so what it currently is, modal is open. The second one is the function that we're able to call to modify this value. Okay, and we have to use state as part of the React library to create this state, modal is open. Okay, I know it sounds confusing. Once you see it happen, okay, in the code, then it'll make a little bit more sense. Okay, so let's actually do this. And if you just want to follow along while I code it, and then, we go back to it after, that's totally fine. Okay, so we're into do.js. Now, we want to, at the very top, import. Ooh, bless me. Excuse me. We want to import React, and we also want to import use state from React. You can see it auto-completes there. Okay, so this is grayed out a little bit right now because we're not using it. Now, in our function to do props, before function delete handler, okay, we're going to create these consts, which is going to have two elements in its array. The first one's the value that will be either true or false, whether our modal is open or not. So that saves, the current value of the state that our app is in. The second one, set modal is open, is going to be a function that we create to be able to access and change the state value. Okay, so you can see they're unused right now. They don't really exist. Modal is open and set modal is open haven't been called anywhere else in this app. So we're just defining them right here. Okay, now the default value is false, so the modal will be not open by default. Now, nothing's going to happen right now because I haven't actually tied these two functions, or this function and this variable, this const, to anything yet. So let's do that now. So on the next screen, we have a function delete handler, right? And before, okay, so currently for me right now, in my code, I just have console.log clicked, right, in here. Well, we're going to delete this, or you can comment it out if you want, and we're going to put some new code, some new logic in here. I'll comment in here, new logic to handle click event on delete button. All right. So what do we want to put in here? What kind of logic? Well, we want to set the modal to being open. If they click that delete handler button, we want to set the modal to be open. So what's happening in here when I call this set modal is open function, you can see it auto-completes, it starts auto-completing. Okay, well, it expects a value, it expects a Boolean value, either true or false. Well, when I click the button, what do I want to happen? If I click delete, do I want the modal to open up or do I want it to stay closed? What do you guys think? Yeah, we want it to open, totally. So set modal open, well, we want that to be true. Okay, so set modal open true and end that line with a semicolon. So what's happening here now is we are now calling this function and we are now passing or setting that initial value that used to be false and changing it to true. Okay, so what this will do, this will only trigger when the button's clicked, right? Because this delete handler is in the on click of this button. This will cause all the components on this page to re-render with the new state that we're passing. Okay, and now that it's true, well, now we want the modal to show when the user clicks the button. So how do we do that? Well, I'll tell you what we don't do. We don't include modal and backdrop in our app, okay? Because then that'll just mean they're always showing. So let's remove those from app.js, right? I just put those there as an example. So let me go back and delete them here. And if I delete these, we can also delete these two references at the top. Okay, those are just imports from backdrop and modal. Okay, so we don't need those. So I just deleted those lines of code. And we can move those imports to todo.js. So we're going to import them into todo.js since we're going to load the components from here, from this component. So we only type slash modal and slash instead of slash components modal because it's the relative path from where the file's point of view is. Okay, so you might have noticed this. Small detail, but helpful for you when you're going to be writing your own code. If I undo what I just deleted in here, okay, so I have them down here by default. I don't want these, right? But in order for them to exist, they have to be imported. And you can see it automatically imported, slash components, slash backdrop. Well, that's because from app.js's point of view, it's outside of the component folder, right? If I close the component folder, we can see app.js is here. It's at a different level. So I have to go into the components folder. So I have to type slash components slash backdrop.js, right? That's why I have to type that. Well, we're going to delete them now anyways, and we're going to move these imports by just Control X. We're going to move them into our to-do, right? But if I import them into my to-do, well, to-do.js is actually inside of the components folder, and it's a sibling, okay, a sister or a brother, to backdrop and modal. So you don't have to do slash components slash backdrop anymore. You just have to type slash backdrop because it's in the same directory. It's in the same folder or the same path. So if I move on to the next slide here, we can see that they're sibling files. Well, if we type modal in here, then when we import it to my code, when we import it, okay, I don't have to do slash components anymore. So I can delete the components and I can just do slash backdrop. Remember, we can also omit the .js because by default, JS files, you don't have to include the extension. Okay, so we've imported them and now we want to render them on this page. Well, we only want to render them if this is true, right? We only want to render the modal and the backdrop if modal is open is true. So we called the function set modal is open to true. Now we need to check the modal is open value to see whether it's true or not. Okay, so by default it's false. But now that we've called this function and set it to true if the button's been clicked, well, now we can check to see if it's true or false now. And we can check that in a dynamic statement in JSX. So after this button, after this div, but before the last div, make sure I got this right. Yeah, inside of the card still. Okay. In a dynamic statement, okay, so that's JSX, we can check if modal is open, is true. We can use a ternary operator, right? Then we want to show modal. If it's true, then we want to show modal. If it's not true, then we want to show null. So that's basically, if this is true, then show the first thing on this side of the colon on the left. If this is false, then don't show anything at all. Right? That's the same as writing, because you can't write if statements, right? Multi-line if statements inside of these, like if modal is open equals true, well, then you want to show your modal, right? But it just won't work like that. So we use a ternary operator because, I mean, you could probably get it to work like that. It's just going to be a lot more code. So this is a shorthand, right? If modal is open is true, show modal. If not, show nothing. Okay, cool. Another way to write this is with some shorthand, even shorter than this. And it might look confusing at first, but I'll explain it to you as I go. We want to repeat this for the backdrop component, right? So we also want to check if the backdrop component has been set to true. So if the modal is open, we also only want to show the modal. We also only want to show the backdrop if the modal is open. So we can use the same Boolean for modal is open. We don't have to create a new state for the backdrop, okay? We only want to show the backdrop if the modal is open. So we are going to check if the modal is open is true, then also show the backdrop, right? So what we can do is if modal is open is true, then show the backdrop, right? If not, show nothing at all. Okay, so that works. And we can check in the browser and let's see if this is working. It looks like it's refreshing. Oh, we've got an error. Module not found. Your attempt to import backdrop, which falls outside of the project SRC directory, is not supported. Okay, let's take a look at this. Backdrop.js, import backdrop from, oh, maybe I need to do /backdrop. See if that works. And yeah, you have to do / because now it's working for that. Okay, so my mistake, I missed a dot on my import. You need a / backdrop. Okay, there we go. So now it's working. And if I click this, what I'm expecting to happen, okay, let me just go back to the code. When I click it, it's going to point in this onClick function to the delete handler function, okay? Then it's going to run this function called set modal is open on line 12 and pass in a true value, which will now change the state, okay? Because we're using this up here, use state. It'll change the state to true for modal is open. And when the state changes from false, which was the initial value, to true, which is what we're passing in, then all of the components on this page will reload. And then as we're reloading, we'll recheck this expression. And now that it's true, well, if it's true, then render the modal. And if it's true, then render the backdrop. So if we click that button and set it to true, well, then look at that. The backdrop renders and the modal renders. Okay, now it doesn't close. It only opens. So now we need to be able to close the modal. So we've added code for opening it. Now we need to add code for closing it. Okay? Now, I said I was going to show you another form of shorthand. Well, here, this is the ternary operator that we're using currently, right? And you can read through this if you want. It might explain it to make a bit more sense. It'll only return a true value if the user clicks the delete handler button. Now, here's another form of shorthand. Here we're using JS shorthand, and this uses the and operator, and it checks if both conditions are true. So if modal is open is true, and modal exists, so it does exist. Obviously, we created the code for it. Well, then if they're both true, then the second value is returned, which is obviously our modal function or component. So because modal or component will always return true, that's just how the code works. A component will always return true. Well, as soon as modal is open is set to true, then they're both true and it will render. So we can use that shorthand actually if we want to right here on the backdrop. And I'll show you there's no difference between the two of them. Right, so we can do one or the other. One's a little bit shorter. You don't have to write null. Right, so it saves you a little bit of time. Okay. Now, we want to be able to close the modal, right? Well, we need to add another custom click method or click event handler on our backdrop, right? So we are going to add a function here that we can set modal is open now back to false, which will now re-render all of the components and set them to false, which will close them, right? They won't be rendered anymore. So we're going to create a new function. So just like we did with delete handler, we're going to create something called close modal handler here. And we can see here, I'm going to create it right in the same place where I created delete handler. I'm going to call it close modal handler, and we'll pass in the false value instead of the true value. So let's do that. On my backdrop, I'm going to add my custom click method, okay, equals. And then here we can call this whatever we want as long as we spell it the same. Close modal handler. Oh, and we have to put it all inside. I didn't realize this. I have to put it inside right after backdrop before the end bracket. Okay. Okay, and then I'm going to create it up here. I'm going to create that function, close modal handler, right? And we're going to just call the exact same logic that we called on line 12 where we did set modal is open. We're just going to call it and set it to false this time. So set modal is open to false. Okay, so what that'll do is we're going to have to create a custom click method on the backdrop. So if they just click anywhere on the gray outside of the backdrop, it'll close, right? So anytime they click on the background, that gray background, it'll close the modal. And we'll also make it close the backdrop, obviously. But because we're using set modal is open or modal is open as the indicator to show the backdrop and the modal, well, when we check if it's false, once we set it to false, it'll turn both the modal and the backdrop off, right? Because this is what triggers whether or not it's going to be set to false or true, whether or not that's going to show. So we're going to add this function so we can eventually set the modal is open to false. Now we also need to be able to call set modal is open to false when the confirm or the cancel buttons are clicked, right? So this is great. They can click the gray backdrop and it'll set it to false. We can try this right now. Let's practice. Okay. We'll run it in the browser really quick here. So if I refresh, I click my button, and then if I click anywhere on the gray here, oh, it's not working. Well, you want to know why? Because we added a click handler, right? We added a click handler here, my custom click method, but there's a slight difference between line 23 and line 27. With line 23, it's on a button, right? And this button's lowercase because it's a pre-made React component, right? They created that. Well, this one on line 27, it's a capital, and it's a custom-made React component by me, the user, right? I created backdrop.js. Well, there's no default on-click method in here because if I go to backdrop.js, there's no function in here called onClick. So it's not going to know what to call. It's not going to know what to do. Whereas when React library made the button component, they gave all of these components with the default lowercase values on click functions, and they called them on click so that we could just reference them the same way, right? So we're going to have to add a click handler to the backdrop.js file so that it gets called from there when we click it. Okay, because it's a custom component, we can't call the onClick method or prop that comes built in on default elements like btn or div like we did earlier. So they don't, because it's not a built-in component, they don't know what the onClick prop is, right? It has to be configured 100% by us because it's a custom component. So we want to make sure, okay, that this click method exists in our custom component here up in backdrop.js. So we need to create it in here. So my custom click method, I'm going to control C. Now I could call this onClick, right? It might be a little bit confusing for you guys who are learning this because then you might be like, oh, what the heck? Like I thought onClick existed everywhere. OnClick only exists in pre-built components. So up here, I'm going to have to create 100% all of the logic that happens in this backdrop component, right? So my custom click method, I'm going to control C, and I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to have to create that function from scratch, right? So let's go to our backdrop.js and take a look at this. So here's my custom click method with close modal handler in it, right? This function, close modal handler, is going to be passed into backdrop.js as a prop, and it will trigger the onClick method in here because the backdrop is a div. Okay, so because this is a pre-built component div, well, it has access to the onClick method, right? So here we can access props.myCustomClick method, which is actually going to receive the close modal handler function. So on click on that div, it'll actually set the close modal handler function, which is going to be passing the false value, if that makes sense. So we're kind of function forwarding, if that makes sense. We're passing in this custom click method into another on click method, which is going to then be able to call the close modal handler function. So we're passing this function into this on click function. So we're forwarding it until we're able to actually access the custom onClick function that React library made. Okay, so just like before, we're passing a prop into a component, and we need to be able to receive it inside our custom component. So we have to add props in this argument up here, up in backdrop. But then we also need to forward the function that's passed from todo.js, close modal handler, and pass it into the onClick method on our div backdrop. We can use this onClick method here because this is a built-in React component. And when we call our custom click event handler inside of this dynamic expression, it's basically saying props.myCustomClick method, aka close modal handler. We're forwarding this close modal handler function into this onClick method prop in our div. Okay, so let's code this up. Now that you've seen that, I think the arrows help a little bit. So in here, I need to accept props. I need to be able to accept properties in backdrop. Okay, now from to do, what else are we calling? Well, we're passing a myCustomClick method equals close modal handler as a prop, right? So now that I'm accepting props, well, inside of the div, after the class name, I can also add an onClick prop that's going to accept in a dynamic expression props dot my custom, right? My custom click method. And there it is. So now we're forwarding that function into here, into this onClick, right? That they've put into the pre-built div. So now that we've done that, now that we've forwarded that function, well, now if we click the gray, look at that, it disappears. I click the gray, it disappears. I click the gray, it disappears. It works on all three to-dos, right? That event handler is everywhere, and I don't have to custom code on every single button. It already has, it already exists for each component, which is the really nice thing about React. Okay, cool. So hopefully that makes sense. There's the code again. I'll leave that up for a couple minutes. You guys give me a thumbs up if you're following along, if this makes sense. If there's something you want me to cover again that's a little confusing, let me know and I'll try my best.
Could I just see your CSS? My screen doesn't, mine's all grayed out. I don't have a background on my, are you sure cancel and all that. I missed what you did there to make that happen. And it's at the bottom of my list as well. I think you added something at the last that put it in that place and stuff.
Which part of the CSS do you need here?
See, I have the background. Did you change something on the modal? I don't know. I'll take a screenshot of this and look at mine and compare.
Okay.
Thanks.
I know with my, right now, I need to fix, I think my pop-up is showing a little bit to the left, and I want it to be centered. So I need to fix that. And I think what's causing that would be here, 50% minus 15 REM. Did get rid of this. Fixed, centered. Figure that out. Well, we might have to come back to that. I'm not sure why it's popping up on the left here, but okay. So we've forwarded our function into here. I'll deal with that CSS afterwards, fixing it and making it centered. But for now, let's try to get those buttons on the modal itself. Okay, so when we go to our website and I have the modal, that's fine. I can click on the gray over here. But if I actually click on this button, confirm and cancel, nothing happens. Okay, so I need to actually call the same function and set the state to false to close, just like when I click the gray. I need to do that here too. So how do we do that? Well, here's my modal.js, okay? And here's my to-do.js. So let me explain this a little bit. So modal.js, we've got our two buttons, right? Confirm and cancel. And we want to actually have some on-click props here that we accept. So just like Backdrop accepted a props and then had an on-click method, we're going to do the same thing in modal.js. So we're going to have a on-click method, okay, which is going to have a dynamic expression, and we're going to, we're going to put something in there eventually. We don't have the code for it yet. And we're going to have another on-click method down here, right? So we're going to put two functions in here that we're going to get passed into as props. So we have to be able to accept props in our modal as well, right? Now, well, what are we going to accept as a prop? Well, just like Backdrop accepted props.myCustomClick method from to-do. So here's my custom click method, right? Well, in modal, I can also pass it a custom click method here, right? So I can call them whatever I want. I can call it on cancel, okay? And then I can also make another one called on confirm, all right? So on cancel and on confirm. Now it's giving me an error right now just because I'm not passing anything into it. That's fine. We'll put the code in there later. But on cancel and on confirm, well, that's our prop that we're going to be passing in to this modal.js. So in cancel, we're going to do props.onCancel, right? Props.onCancel.
I think when you did your on cancel part, you didn't do the equal sign.
Oh,
So
probably
that's
not.
why it's not pulling it up.
Okay, let's just take a look back at that. On confirm doesn't have the equal sign. Yes. Okay, so we've got on cancel and on confirm, right? In my to-do.js. Okay. Now, in here, just like how we passed it, this is interesting now. We don't actually have to do props.onCancel. You could. Okay. Now, you could totally do it the way we did it before, props.on. This is the cancel button, right? Yeah. Props.onCancel, just like how we did it before. And I'm going to show you. That's one way to do it, right? Props.onCancel and props.onConfirm. That's the exact way that we did it here in backdrop.js, right? How we passed in props.myCustomClick method. So here I've passed in onCancel and onConfirm. Now, onCancel and onConfirm, they don't have any actual logic associated with them in to-do.js. Well, I want them to close the modal handler, right? I want them to set modal as open to false. So just like how backdrop passed in close modal handler, I'm going to pass in close modal handler to both of these, right? So now it'll call this logic, set modal is open to false, right? So we have on cancel, close modal handler. And if they click the confirm, well, we're also going to close the modal handler. Because for now, I'm just going to show you, we're going to set those two buttons to the exact same code. I'm not going to have a different different piece of logic for the confirm and the cancel right now. We're just going to close both. Okay. Excuse me. Okay. So now that we've closed our modal handler and we're passing it in like this, I'm going to show you. Okay, so this should work. I'm going to come in here. I'll show you the app. I hit delete. I hit the confirm button. It closes. I hit cancel. It closes. I click the gray. It closes. Okay, so there we go. We've got a working app. Now I want to show you one other option for what we could do in modal.js. Instead of accepting the prop.onCancel here, okay, what we could actually do is we can create another method to handle logic if we wanted to have multi-line JavaScript. Okay, so if you wanted to have, I don't know, for some reason, and this would probably be quite common, if you wanted to have a custom method in here. So for here, you know, I want cancel handler. That's going to be my custom method here. Well, I can actually, remember how we typed just pure JavaScript outside of the return function? Well, up here, I can make another nested function, call it cancel handler, and then I can write multi-line JavaScript, right? Because these expressions, these curly braces, they don't allow you to write multi-line JavaScript if you wanted to have if statements, if you wanted to have, you know, multiple expressions and all that kind of logic. So what we can do is we can just call and function forward another function into this function, and then we can type all our multi-line JavaScript right here. So obviously, I just want to call props.onCancel like I did before, props.onCancel. And this time I have to use the two brackets with it, right? Because we're in JavaScript mode. Down here, I don't call the two brackets because we're in JSX. It's interpreted. Here I do, right? And so that way, in here, if I wanted to do, multiple things, if I wanted to do a console.log and typed, and type user clicked cancel, if I wanted to do an alert, if I wanted to do some math, you could do all of that stuff up in here. So this is another way to call it. Instead of just calling props.onConfirm, well, then you could just call your props.onConfirm as well as all your other logic, right? So if I save this, it'll still work, but now there will just be extra functionality when I click the cancel button. If I open up my console, right, and I click the cancel, we can see user click cancel. So you can put multiple lines of logic in your code, and that'll happen every time I click cancel for each of these buttons, right? So very cool. We've got working, confirm, cancel, and gray button, and it works for all of the buttons on every single to-do item, which is really, really cool. And there's the strength of React, right? Like just like that, that is so much quicker and easier to compartmentalize or componentize our app into different components, like we've done here, instead of doing it in native JavaScript. And you'd have to create, a handler for button one, and a handler for button one confirm one, and a handler for button one cancel one, and a handler for button two confirm one. Like it would just be a nightmare. Cool. All right. Moving on, I got a couple more slides. So we tested out. Oh no, no more slides. I thought I had a couple more slides. That's it. So I do want to try to fix obviously my code, the way it's rendering right now. The to do is over here. Not sure that that's what I want. So what I like to do is I come down here. That's why it's not working. My left isn't being called. Let's see what CSS I had. Okay, so I did have left. Just give me 1 second. Okay, sorry. Just had to go grab something. Okay. So we can see that this is not rendering for some reason. So you can see here the Z index. This is interesting. If I check it off, then we can see it's behind the gray backdrop, and that's not what we want. We want it to be in front, right? I'm going to try typing this left auto. Does that work? No. There you go. 50% works. But then I want minus. So 50%, 50% minus. That's why we have minus 15 REM. But that doesn't work. Why is that?
Would it be possible that it's maybe needs to be position absolute instead of fixed?
And then just 50%.
I'm not sure, but
I still need to move it over a little bit. We can see this would work normally. 50% minus. I need to use the calc function. So calc should allow me to, yeah. I should be able to calc off of it. I'm surprised a little bit that it's not working because I tested this out earlier and it did work. So calc 50%, yeah. 15% minus 50 pixels? No, see, it doesn't like it when I do that. Oh, does that work? Uh, some spacing. There we go. You need to have spaces in your calc function. That's what it is. All right, we figured it out. So in index.css here, 50% minus 15 rem, you have to have spaces on either side over here of the subtract sign. And if I save this and we come down, then there it goes. Works. Funny little things like that in programming. The white spaces matter. So cool. So now it's centered and it works. Very, very cool. Any
So is the
questions?
positioning, sorry, is the
Yeah.
positioning set for um absolute or the
No, I kept
fixed?
it fixed. Yeah, I kept it the same. So it's everything is the exact same I had here in the PowerPoint. You just have to make sure here where my highlighter is on my mouse that you have the space on either side of that subtraction sign.
And which slide is that? I've got a few blank slides at the end of the
39.
39. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, I have a couple blank slides at the end too. I thought I had a couple more to go and then it was just over.
Okay.
Sweet. All right, well, hopefully everyone's got that working and you guys can start to see the benefit of ReactJS and why it's so popular and widely used in industry today. Um, I think for the last assignment for you guys, I still have to draft up the actual um, paper for it. I'll have that probably for today and I'll post a little video explaining it. But if you want to get started on it before I post that video today, just to get a couple hours extra on it, what you guys will be doing is taking your websites. So hopefully, Michelle, for yours, I can do this. I gotta end the recording and start a new one maybe. Or no, it doesn't matter. So you'll be taking your websites, and we can see this is a PWA. Like I've got it downloaded in my app here. I finally got it working. And for some reason, my computer wasn't very happy when I tried to download it as a PWA, but now it is working. And we can see it's responsive. And as we go down into mobile view, right, we've got our navigation menu up here that changes. And as we go back into maybe tablet view, we've got our navigation menu that changes up into a horizontal nav bar, right? So your task for your assignment, your final assignment in this class, will be changing or adapting this website, this PWA that you guys have made, into a React PWA app. Okay, so you'll have to have a minimum of 2 to 3 components. So like for our to-do list, we have a component for the to-do list itself. We have a component for the backdrop. We have a component for the for the modal, this little thing here. So I know your guys' apps aren't necessarily completely have a ton of functionality in them, but if you could add a couple things that just implement components and app-like features where, you click, you could have a component for each of these pages, right? So it doesn't have to load a new HTML page. Like here I'm on index.html. And when I click survey, it has to load an HTML page. Well, the handy thing with React is if you have everything in state, right, then it's just instant and it acts like an app. So that's the cool thing with this. Like if I open this in my PWA and I open it here with my service worker, okay, and I bring this app over, it doesn't have to load a new page. Oops, come on. It doesn't have to load a new page. It's just acting like an app, right? So if you have each of your navigation menus as a state in your app, then look at that. Just instant, right? So it's basically a single page application, but it loads through React and changes state depending on all of that, right? And it can work offline. And you basically just created an app for your phone, but it also works in the web for desktop. So if you want to get started on that, I'll post the paper and the assignment later today. It'll be due on the last day of class on the 17th at midnight. And we'll kind of continue to build on to, our React repertoire next week as we continue to learn about this stuff. But continue to practice this to do. I'll be posting more stuff with this for you guys to work on asynchronously to improve your React skills. And then if you want to get started on that assignment, which I'll be posting more information about a little bit later, then you can start converting your PWAs into React PWAs and just build on all of that, right? Very cool, guys. I'm going to end the recording here. I'm going to
I
try
have
to
a
end the recording here.
question.
Second, it's just lagging a little bit. Goodness. My WebEx is recording. There we go. And stop. Yes. Okay.